Who are just now joining us. Today's webinar is titled the NOVA Program Area Reporting Q&A Session, which actually is not even a webinar. It's more of an informal presentation based on last week's formal webinar. During that webinar, there were quite a few questions regarding TE and program area reporting, and so we thought that it would be a good idea to bring Jay on for this kind of impromptu meeting, just in case there are any additional questions that you all may have that were not addressed last week, or if there are any areas of TE that you would like to see that will assist you with your program area reporting. So we have Jay in today to be able to handle those questions for you all. Based on last week, we did develop a Q&A document, and I have posted the URL of where that Q&A document lives on the California Adult Education website. I have also provided I've also placed the document in the resources pod, so if you would like to download it to your computer right now, you have both avenues which you can access that document. Jay will be going over some of those questions that were included in that particular document. We are taking attendance today, although this is kind of an informal meeting. We are still taking attendance. So if you've logged in with more than one person, please be sure to let us know. And then also if you have logged in using an acronym, your initials or your consortium name, please let us know who you are so that we can account for everyone. This session will be recorded and will be available on the California Adult Education website. So I'll be sure to post the URL of exactly where today's recording will be, as well as where last week's recording, PowerPoint presentation, and Q&A document are on the website. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please be sure to let us know by typing into the chat pod. Throughout the session today, Jay will be available to address your questions. He will be sharing his screen, or he is currently sharing his screen, so he's not able to see the chat pod. So if we do not get to you immediately, please be patient. We have plenty of time to go over any questions that you may have. So just hold the questions and we will be sure to address them. That is all I have. I'm not seeing anyone with any technical difficulties, so that's great. I'll turn it over to Jay, who will get us started with today's session. Jay?
Okay, everybody can hear me hopefully, and I'll just say, can everybody see TE on your screen? Everybody's got a slightly different view, I think, but can everybody see how I have TE open on the screen? I'll play around with a couple menus to verify to everybody that it really is TE, so everybody can see that. Okay, great. Okay, good. So what we did here, we spent a little bit of time here the last 10-15 minutes, is I generated a couple reports on the screen here in advance, just so we don't have to worry about spending time watching the wheel churn or whatever. We've got it already generated. What I'll also say, and I don't know if this is going to be perceived as good news for everybody or bad news, hopefully good news, this is probably not going to be a long session. All I plan to do is show this report for the NOVA requirement due September 1. There is like a random new feature related to CAPE reporting that I was going to also show, and I was really only going to show it because it literally came out the last couple days, and it is a CAPE webinar, so it does seem like, hey, might as well present it here to a CAPE audience. I do have these FAQs from the webinar that Neil did on August 21 as well, so I was going to really just roll through these FAQs first. A lot of them have to do with what I call the CAPE program hours report. So that, of course, is one that I have on the screen already, and I was going to just demonstrate, how that goes. So what I'll bring up is, does anybody have anything fixed that they were really hoping to hear? I guess with all the babbling I've done the last couple minutes, does that sound more or less what you signed up for? Or was there something more fixed than that you were really hoping to hear that you're somewhat disappointed is not on my agenda right now? I'll let you chat and either confirm or deny any of my suspicions here. Nobody has any response at all, nothing pro or con.
No, nothing
No.
as of yet, Jay.
Not a darn thing, huh? Okay. Well, I don't know if that's good news or bad news then, huh? Okay, so I've got these questions up here, and so I think for the start is people are wondering about that report. So let's just go ahead and show where that report is so you can see the TE menu. So on my screen, I'm just showing you where you would find it is, here it's called Cape Program Hours. So I've already generated it, so I'm not going to simulate running it because I've already got it, but here's where you would find it on the menu in case you were wondering about that. I think that was asked, probably 4 or 5 times in that Q&A. So I went ahead and just generated it. So this is what the report looks like. And we're small enough that I think I can keep peppering you. I would be interested in just knowing, are you all familiar with this report at all, yes or no? Have you run this and seen it before? Or is it more like this is the first time you've ever seen it? So everybody's jumping in yes. I assume that means yes, you've seen it before. Yes, you already knew how to do this. So good, thank you everybody. So the part 2 of that question is, have you been using it at all for this NOVA reporting, or did you just know it existed? But come on, give me a break. Anything more than that, you haven't really done much with it. Have you been using it? So yes, okay, thank you, Sandy. Shannon, okay, everybody's saying you're using it, great. Okay, so all this does, and this is relating to some of the questions, is that it is just aggregated attendance hours. So if I'm your student and I'm in 3 classes, we'll just say, hey, I'm in 1 ESL class, 1, CTE class, and 1 pre-apprenticeship class, and I've got 50 hours in ESL, 20 hours in CTE, and 20 hours in pre-apprenticeship, then this report will simply count the 50 hours in the ESL row, the 20 hours in Career Tech Ed, and the 20 hours in pre-apprenticeship. It really is that simple. It's just where the hours go by class, and it just aggregates it up based on how you designated that class. So in TE, obviously it's program hours, so this report is 100% based on attendance hours. In TE, attendance hours is a feature of the TE class record. It looks like a pretty familiar cast of characters, so I think you're all familiar enough with TE to know what I'm talking about when I talk about the class record. That is, you have the class record in TE where you're just assigning that student to a class, and that class record is where 100% of the attendance hours information goes. That is, TE considers attendance hours a feature of that class. So the program is about where what you've designated for that class. Okay, and yes, it will include folks with less than 12 hours. This one won't be so worried about that. This one will just basically give you all the hours in aggregate. It won't worry about the 12 hours. And again, it's going to give you the compounded hours across all programs. That's going to be all the same. It doesn't matter what kind of attendance hours it is. That's a big deal for importing, but when it's all in TE, that doesn't really matter so much. It's all about the total number of hours that student has. And David, to your question, it's not that worried about 12 hours. It's just giving you that aggregated number of hours. And this would be more of a Neil question, but I don't think the program hours stuff is anything that they're really worried about the qualifying for outcomes. They're just looking for a total number of hours served by program. So yes, that requires 1 hour, but obviously, well, of course you have 1 hour, because if you don't have 1 hour, well, you're not going to have anything here in the first place. And so yes, this is for 1819, so that's good. Thank you, Dana. That's getting me back to these Q&A questions. So with this, we're using the 1819 rules here for the moment. So some of you I know have been to the training Neil and I have done. If not those, you were at the one we did online about a month ago, or if not that, you were at the one we did at Summer Institute about 2 months ago. So we've now done several presentations where we've talked about changes for 1819, and the way we're doing the hours is something that's going to be different in 1920, But for now, somewhat on purpose, we've left this report exactly as is. That is, the report is following the same rules as it did in February when we did this NOVA drill back on that, I think it was February 15th. We created this report for that NOVA exercise everybody had to do last February 15th. So this was the date, I guess, February 8th. We've left that report unchanged. In between discussions with us at CASAS and folks like Neil, we all agreed that we needed to purposefully leave it for 1819. We decided no, it would not be worth it at all to make a bunch of these changes in haste. And quite frankly, it would be better to leave it under 1819, given that this exercise you're doing for September 1 is all about 1819 hours anyway. So for those kind of common sense reasons, we're keeping 1819 rules in place for this activity. After you complete everything on September 1, my understanding is that there's going to be another NOVA exercise, where you're going to have a bunch of stuff due December 1, and I think for that one, we'll be moving more into 1920 for that exercise. So when you get around to doing this for December 1, that's when we should have the new rules for 1920 built in. So for now, yes, Dana, you're going to get some of those old rules where the old rules really fit in are with workforce reentry. So a lot of you remember this, and if you didn't remember it, you know it because this is a change that we've been talking about a good bit for 1920. That is, workforce reentry through the 1819 year was what you might call a derived field. That is, you could mark that workforce readiness and TE, and that would be one way to automatically get the student in workforce reentry, but it was also a derived field in the sense that if they were 55 years or up, that would automatically put them in reentry, and there were certain barriers you could mark that would also automatically put that person in reentry. It wouldn't necessarily negate their status as being enrolled in any other program, but by definition they would show up in that workforce reentry bucket as well. So I'll just show this sample here, is that this hours total is what we're using for NOVA because the number of hours for workforce reentry in this example are just those ones that we specifically designated for workforce readiness or reentry. If we expand that view, we probably have lots more hours in here that happen to be for folks over 55 or happen to be for folks with those specific barriers. But again, we just need to report those hours in one bucket here, so the reentry numbers are a little bit low. So I'm going to stop here because I'm just babbling and I'm just kind of going non sequitur here. So is any of this making sense at all? Is this like helping any? Is this on the right wavelength, or am I off in J-land not making any sense at all? Okay, thank you, Shelley. Okay, one person responding, maybe, Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's how we have this. So we're using 1819 years, so we're still using the 55 years or up, and we're still using those barriers to designate reentry. Just to reiterate, the change that a lot of you have heard already for 1920, we will still have this program, exist. We are changing the name from workforce reentry to workforce preparation. That makes it a little bit more consistent with WIO and so on, I think, and a lot of you have seen that in things like IET, so we kind of think that will be a better title and more consistent with federal reporting, so that's kind of why we're changing it. We're also changing it because we're not going to make it that derived field anymore. I know that derived business drove most of you ridiculously crazy because what a lot of you would rightfully say is you have all kinds of students that are over 55 years old and of course want absolutely nothing to do with workforce, so it seemed borderline preposterous to a lot of you that they were all going into reentry just because they were older, when a lot of you said the fact that they were older made them less likely to be workforce, not more likely. So there were a lot of, we'll just say, oxymorons with that derived thing. Most of you said that did way more harm than good. So I guess I'll just say we'll hear you, and we're going to get rid of that because, yeah, that did cause a lot of ridiculously unnecessary confusion. So we'll get rid of the barriers. We'll get rid of the 55 plus. So when you do this again, you won't really have to worry about those extra issues. Okay. Let's see here. What I'm going to do is go ahead and show, while we're talking about this, are you all familiar with this option at the bottom? I'm scrolling all the way down. I've got to say it would be nice if we could scroll a little farther, but anyway, there's this little series of radio buttons at the far bottom of the setup window. Number one, can you see it on the screen now? Number two, have you used this before? That is, you've got 3 different ways to run this report. So have you can you see it now? And then part 2 of it, have you seen this before? I guess that's really the question I'm more concerned with. Have any of you used this? Okay, you've seen it, but you've never used it. Okay, so you can see it on the screen, but people haven't really used it. Okay, you've seen it, not used it is what I'm hearing it most of you say. So to be clear, what we just showed is the NOVA format. So I'll go back just so you can see it. So you know NOVA always is erring on the side of simplicity. So if all you're worried about is, gee, I just want to get NOVA off my back, I don't really care about all this. I mean, that's probably not you, because you wouldn't have shown up at this webinar if this was you, I guess. But if you didn't care about any of this and you just wanted to get NOVA off your back and you just wanted to make sure you plugged in the right numbers to NOVA, all you do is generate the report, copycat these numbers. If you do so, you're 100% good to go. That's all NOVA wants. It's just an hours figure to put in each of these 7 program areas. So to cut to the chase, you just run it and get it. And if you're just worried about meeting NOVA, that's the beginning, middle, and end of this. Just copy these numbers. We've talked to Neil a lot. You know, he definitely agrees the way we have this program, the way we have this formatted is definitely the way they need it for NOVA. There's a lot more information we could add, but for NOVA purposes, this is all we need. This takes care of it, so to speak. Okay, but that said, given that we're preaching more to the, hey, I want to know more choir here, there is a way to make more sense of it. A lot of you have said, yeah, we've had trouble making sense of any of this, so you might want to select this middle one where it basically shows more about it breaks down the different enrollee types, and it also breaks down workforce reentry. So I'm going to just go ahead and select that second radio button and go ahead and regenerate this report, and this will get us more of the expanded view. Like I said, hopefully this wheel won't turn around for too long here, but that's why I set it up here at the beginning so we wouldn't have to do that. But in any case, this is going to give us the larger view, so you can see this gives us the number. So this relates a little bit to your question, David. We're just looking for those with 1+ hours. That is, we're just looking for participants here. We're not looking for the qualified enrollees like we are for outcomes. So here's our number of enrollees with 1+ hours. So this is the number of students that are factoring into this equation, and then here's the total number of hours that we have related to it. So you've got this proportional, so you've got the total hours and proportional hours. So that has to do with the duplication. So you can see some of these look pretty solid. Some of these, look very suspicious. The one that I'll just say looks the most suspicious is that one related to workforce reentry, and the issue there is that's where most of it is getting rolled up into other programs. So the example I gave you is you might have that career tech ed student who happens to be 58 years old. They're in career tech ed because they are over 55. They also get flagged for reentry. If they're just being flagged for that reentry and they're in one of those other programs, the way we're breaking the tie is we're putting them in that other program. In my example, you went out of your way to flag them for career tech ed, their workforce reentry, only because of those derived issues. So in our mind, that means that the dominating program is necessarily career tech ed in that example. So we've got to pick one program and only one. So in that case, that individual and all of those hours would go in the career tech ed bucket, not workforce reentry. So I'll pause. Does that make sense, yes or no? Okay, thank you for humoring me. Thank you, Arturo, Shelley. Okay, enough people are saying yes that I'll move on. Thank you. So I just sanity check because I'm not following a script and can't see you, so I'm going to look for that sanity check more than you like, most likely. So in any case, here's how we work it. So we always go that way. The other thing to bring up, and this I don't have in front of me, but the question that came up in that Q&A from last week a lot was, what if you've got more than one program to the class? So this is the logic we've had built into this report. This is also something Neil and I have been talking about a lot in training. Is last February, that was a big issue with the way TE was, is we had this report, I think, programmed since last October. So for about 3 or 4 months, we had this report available. A small number of you were aware of it and were using it. There were lots of problems with the report, though, between October and February. The two issues, one was the reentry issue where we didn't have it all derived correctly. The other was when you had more than one program assigned to the class. So we've been talking about this a lot in training where, a lot of you might have more than one program designated to a class. I'll reiterate, if you're doing that, that's definitely not a problem and not an error. And I've been saying there are, in fact, card-carrying examples of when we've suggested you might want to consider designating more than one program to a class. One would be that IET, that a lot of you are doing for WIOA, where you're combining ESL and Career Tech Ed for that integrated education and training. And if you're doing iBest or co-teaching, we've been saying the way you can do that is create one class and designate that one class as simultaneously ESL and Career Tech Ed. If you're doing that way, not only is that okay, but we've even been recommending that as a way to handle that co-teaching model for IET. Just to give one more card-carrying example, is if you're working with the power assessment or 2A to 5A and adults with disabilities, we've been saying designate those classes as both adults with disabilities, because that's who they are, of course, as well as ABE. By adding ABE, that, and giving them an ABE enrollment, that's how you make sure that they get under the WIOA 2 umbrella, and you can use results like power for payment points and all that. So there's lots of other examples, but I'll use those two as the card-carrying examples where we've gone way out of our way to say over the years where you might have more than one program assigned to the class. So what we did here in this February 8th revision is we arbitrarily just said we're splitting all that 50-50. So if you've got an IET class that's for CTE and ESL and you just put it all in one class, by definition, TE will put 50% of the hours in CTE and 50% of the hours in ESL. So what we've been talking about a lot here more recently is we've been formalizing that. In February, we just did that arbitrarily because we had to have a way to basically reconcile that issue. Otherwise, there was a 100% chance the report wasn't going to work. So we had to pick a method to basically have that work correctly. So by having it set that way, we had to figure out some way. The fairest way in our minds seemed to be to just break everything 50-50. So I'll just say we've had discussions with Neil in his office a lot over the summer about this and all the other changes, and we all pretty strongly agree just leaving it at 50-50 makes more sense than any other solution. So we've kind of formalized that to say that if you create a class record and you designate more than one program to that class, well, by definition, that's you saying it's a 50-50 split, and you just need to live with that if that's what you're doing. If you know that 50-50 is the wrong answer, and I realize sometimes it is, so in this example, let's just say you designate it as ESL and Career Tech Ed, but in this example, you know good and well it's really 75% ESL and 25% Career Tech Ed. Well, that's fine, but in that example, you would need to create the two separate classes and just carefully, assign the 75% of the hours to the ESL class and the 25% of the hours to the CTE. So I'll just pause on that. Is everybody still with me? Yes or no? Okay, that's your story and you're sticking to it. Okay, so the other big thing is that whole derived issue with workforce reentry or workforce preparation. So again, this is going away, but again, like Dana was saying, we're still using the 1819 rules for this NOVA evolution, so you still need to take them into account just a little bit longer. So I'll just say here, by doing the expanded view, you can see exactly how TE is reconciling that reentry. So you can see there's the row for reentry that gives you the total number of enrollees we're counting for reentry and giving you just the total aggregate number of hours. That is, we just bean counted all the hours. Every hour of instruction in this program year in TE that can conceivably be related to reentry in any way, shape, or form, that's what we're showing by that 83,000. The proportional hours is basically is what we come up with after we reconcile all the hours, and we reconcile it to where we're not duplicating any of the hours, because of course we absolutely cannot duplicate any hours. We've got to reconcile all of it. But by deriving reentry by definition, that means just about all those hours that we derived are going to be duplicated hours. As I already explained, if it's a derived field for reentry where we're just getting it from the barrier to employment or from the 55 plus years of age, by definition we'll prioritize the other program in that instance, not reentry. So that's what we come up with the proportional hours, is we have 83,000 total hours conceivably related to reentry, but at the end of the day we had 7,400 of those hours that we're really just assigning to reentry that aren't duplicated somehow and assigned to some other program. So that 7480 you can see comes from that first bucket. So there's basically three buckets we can come up with. One is by going out of our way and marking that workforce readiness or workforce preparation program in TE. That is, we specified that student is a reentry or workforce prep student. There's no barrier, no age range or any of that. We just had a short-term CTE class that we wanted to call workforce prep, so we called it that. If so, that will obviously go in the reentry bucket. If so, those will be the hours that we'll go out of our way to make sure get put in as workforce reentry. Then we also have some in CTE where they might be that 55 plus years of age and they're also, in CTE. So if they've got the barrier or they're 55 plus and they're only marked for career tech ed and they're not marked any way, shape, or form as workforce prep, then that will be that second row for CTE only. Then there's going to be other times when you might have marked CTE and workforce preparation for those students. If so, that's another bunch of hours. You can see that's where most of our hours are coming from in this report. Just know that all 66,000 of those hours where we've assigned the hours to workforce prep and to CTE both, by default we put all those hours into CTE in this example. So I'll just say, do you feel like you can reconcile that as much as you need to, where again, if you're having trouble figuring out where the proportional hours are going, you can run this in expanded format and this will see all the different ways in which TE is coming up with those reentry hours. I'll say it's come up a little bit now. It was a much bigger question in February, but it's come up a few times now too, is why are those reentry numbers so small? Where did my hours disappear? So again, you're not going to recoup any hours. They didn't disappear at all. It's just that you had duplicate hours that needed to be unduplicated. But if you want to figure out how that unduplication took place, a real good way to figure that out is to run this expanded format where you can see the different ways in which TE assigns it to reentry. I'm not saying that's the only way you could have that happen, but it's by far the number one answer. And I'll just reiterate, for 1920, we're not going to be doing any of that derived business anymore. So when we do it for 1920, you won't have to worry about this expansion. We'll still have workforce preparation, but it won't be derived anymore. The people that are in workforce preparation will just be there because you marked them as such, not for all these crazy derived issues. So I'm going to stop again and make sure, is everybody still following me? Any questions on any of this right now? So I'm going to take this as that's your story and you're sticking to it. So I think that's what I needed to show on this report. A couple highlights from the Q&A from last week. So one that I wanted to really bring up that I thought was an outstanding question was the difference between CAPE hours and WIOA hours. I think that's a totally different issue, but another common source of confusion when people are running these reports and looking at NOVA is I think the WIOA federal way of dealing with all this is the way that most of you are more likely to have tattooed in your brain, which is we must unduplicate at the student level and set one student in each program, where for CAPE, we go out of our way to make sure that students in more than one program show up in more than one program. So in this case, like I said, if the student has 20 hours in ESL and 15 hours in ABE, for CAPE reporting purposes, we really necessarily need to go out of our way to have those 20 hours credited to ESL and ESL only, and those 15 hours credited to ABE and ABE only. That is the way CAPE hours work, is they really want TE to go out of its way to distinguish which hours occurred in which program. That distinction is important for CAPE. WIOA, on the other hand, could care less about that distinction, but it cares very, very much. The more important distinction in WIOA land is to make sure that we're unduplicated 125% of the time. So at the end of the day, it wants an unduplicated number. So in that example where the students in ABE and also in ESL, it's mandatory that we basically have that hierarchy that a lot of you know about, which for the record is always going to be ESL 1, ABE 2, and ASE 3. That's the hierarchy we've followed since 1999, that we necessarily follow that hierarchy, because for federal reporting purposes, we must assign each student to one program and one program only. That's because everything must have an unduplicated count. So for federal reporting, it must go out of its way to ensure an unduplicated count, where for things like CAPE program hours, we must go out of our way to make sure all the hours go to all the involved programs and not just get rolled up arbitrarily into one so it's unduplicated. So I'm going to stop right there. Does that make sense? That question came up a couple times in that Q&A document from last week, so I wanted to bring that up. I thought that was a really good question. So that's another, I'll just say, common confusion point with this is, a lot of you know how we unduplicate by program for WIOA. We don't necessarily do that for CAPE, and in fact, CAPE requires it to do the other way. It wants us to show that students are getting hours in multiple programs and not rolling it all up into just one. Okay, so we talked about the 55 plus is going away. We've talked about the barriers are going away. So again, when you enter it's basically TE is just showing whatever you've entered hours-wise. So the whole daily versus cumulated and all that for this purpose should not really matter, because all it's doing is looking at the hours that are already in TE. So if you're importing all the time, that matters, and you need to stay consistent and so on. But this isn't really concerned in any way, shape, or form with how you're doing any of that importing. It's just looking at the hours that are already there. So whether you did cumulated or daily or just entered it straight in TE, it doesn't really matter. It's just looking at the hours you already have. That's a fait accompli as far as this report goes. It's not concerned at all with how any of that importing is done. Okay, so I talked about how we're leaving this report in the old 1819 format. Okay, I think we talked about all the derived issues, and I'll just say some of you were talking about how you had a lot of import issues that were creating numbers that seemed a little bit skewed. I think, in February, that whole difference between what we had in TE and what some other systems had was a big issue. I think that's been reconciled. I'll just say, obviously, in February, if you're talking to us, we're going to say, well, we feel like we reconciled it, and probably some of those other systems didn't reconcile it as thoroughly as we did. So, of course, we were saying, if you wanted the right answer, look at our report, but you were free to use anybody else's. Nova didn't care. If you believe the other system and not us, fine. But from our standpoint, the one that was right was the one on our report. And I really think the two issues I've spent a lot of time talking about are the two issues that are far and away the most likely issues to either show weird numbers here or explain why the numbers in this TE report might be different from your third-party system, is because, again, we insist on splitting everything 50-50. That's what we came up with. And then also that derived issue where we derived all those hours, and we also made the decision of any hours like that that were derived from the date of birth or derived from barriers into re-entry really belonged first and foremost in that other program before they belonged in re-entry. And I think it varies from system to system, but I'll just say I'm not sure all the other systems have that set hierarchy with re-entry in those derived fields in the same way we do. So your re-entry numbers could look different in other systems than they do here in TE. So there were a lot of different things that kind of came out where if you use this expanded format, I'll just say a lot of other issues kind of come up as well. Okay, I've covered this report. I've covered everything in this QA. Last thing, and then I'll be on out of here, is the one other thing I wanted to show is, do you all see the CAPE summary? Okay, thank you, Dana. Thank you, Shelley. Okay, everybody's saying yes, and you all are intimately familiar with this, whether you like it or not, right? Okay, intimately, thank you. All right, everybody's here. Absolutely. Okay, so this is the CAPE summary. And so, okay, let me find, okay, so here's the setup window. And so what I'm bringing here to you now is there's a new little checkbox. It's real easy for this to get lost in the shuffle, but it's a brand new checkbox, or brand new. I think it was in a new build that came out yesterday morning, but this is related to the CAPE reports. It relates a little bit to those data dive tradings. There's more to follow, but for now, this is what we have. So there's a little checkbox where you can run some charts here, in addition to your report. So again, to avoid waiting for the wheels to spin, we'll say the wheels have spun and generated the CAPE summary, and you can now get these nifty little charts if for whatever reason that does something for you. So again, we're in 1920. So some of the data is going to look a little funny. I guess I could have done what we did before, but I wanted to really keep it neutral for public display. But it will basically look at each section of your report and now give you some graphs on it. So basically this one right here for literacy gains is just giving you that item count of number of enrollees with a pair, and number who made gains. So it's basically giving you your 3 columns that you already know from this literacy gain section, and giving you a little graph here in the upper left-hand corner. What I think the most useful feature is this in the upper right, because it's the one feature that doesn't exist on your regular tables, where this is giving you those percentages that we spent a lot of time talking about in those spring trainings, where you can take column C divided by column B and find out the number with a pre-post pair. You can take column D divided by B and find out the percent who made a gain. So in blue, that gives you your persistence rate. In red, that gives you the percent who made an EFL gain. And you can see it gives you separate percentages for each instructional program. And it's just this little teeny tiny checkbox called Show Chart Analysis. It's easy to miss, but it's just one little checkbox, and it just adds a few extra little bells and whistles. So just to finish the thought, less illuminating, but nonetheless something you can generate is you can also generate a graph for these total number of CAPE outcomes. It gives you the number of outcomes, number of literacy gains, HSE, HSE, etc. Also the bean count of services. And then if you scroll down here, you can see by program, it's giving you the graphics of the number of gains by program. So you can see it's a little wild and woolly here with all these bar graphs. We'll probably need to enhance a few of these, but at least for now, you can compare services earned and outcomes earned by program. Again, you can play around with this to your heart's content to kind of compare. If you like this visual format more than the charts we have in the CAPE summary, you can start doing that now. I'll just reiterate, there's more to follow, but the part here that I think is the most valuable from my perspective is this upper right, where if you want to start looking at those performance rates and persistence rates, you can use those graphs to do that. I'll just say consortium managers, and I know that's who some of you are, this is a good way to do those graphs without having to monkey around in Excel. I think just basic show and tell of here's what's going on in these outcomes by program. This probably would be the really, really basic stuff you'd want to show your school board or your college board or your superintendent meetings or whatever if you needed to do that. Okay, so that's it. I went 40 minutes, which was about twice as long as I thought I would go. I got big surprise there, I guess. So I'll just say before I sign off, any questions? This was quick and easy. Hopefully you don't feel cheated by having such a short webinar here. Right, this is by agency that I'm running it for, Ryan, not by consortium. I don't know, I haven't run it by consortium, but you can take a look and see what happens there. I actually haven't tried that to see what happens when you do the consortium view. Okay, anything else? I'm not seeing any questions other than that one from Ryan. Okay, well I can do that. I'll have to do that separate here than right now though, because I can't do that now. I'm not accessed that way, but I can look at it here after the webinar. Okay. Any other questions? I see the one from Ryan, but I don't see anybody else. So I'm taking this. Okay, Veronica, is there anything you needed to jump in and say before we call it a wrap?
No, Jay, if there are no questions, then that's wonderful. I think you've covered everything that people were maybe looking for. So we definitely can get ready to close today's webinar. However, if you do have any questions prior to the September 1st deadline, please be sure to email tap at aebg.org, and we will definitely facilitate any questions that you may have regarding either TE. We'll turn it over to Costas, or if you have any NOVA-related questions, we can definitely assist you. Any policy-related questions, we can assist you as well. For tomorrow, we do have an exciting webinar on online curriculum. Our partner agency, OTAN, will be hosting tomorrow's webinar, and it's on the free online textbook options such as CK12. So definitely be sure to tune into that. If you have any other members of your consortium who may be interested in tomorrow's webinar, please be sure to pass this information along. And yeah, there aren't any more questions, so we'll definitely close it. Remember, the Q&A document is available for you regarding NOVA program area reporting. You also have access to last week's webinar, and the recording for today's webinar will be up on the website later on today. So we'll be sure to get you all of those materials. We thank you all very much for tuning in. We hope that you found this session today useful and helpful as a follow-up to last week's webinar.
And can I jump in one little thing here, Veronica? Sorry.
Yes.
Back to Ryan's question. I was kind of looking at it while you were talking. So just from eyeballing it, it looks like no, I don't think that checkbox is available at the consortium level. If you want, you can email me and I can throw it out there if you want, but I just looked and it doesn't look like it's there. If you are logged in at the consortium level, you could run these graphs for any individual agency in your consortium, but there isn't a checkbox to get that consortium-wide graph, like is more likely what you're asking about, my guess is. Okay, thanks. I see a response. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jay. And thank you for today's session and coming on at short notice to help us make sure that everyone has all the resources and tools they need to complete the September 1st estimates deadline. We thank you all very much for your time and your participation, and have a great afternoon.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jay.